We know some people want our ideas to seem impossible. Ideas like a fairer tax system or reining in the gas industry or transparency in politics. And yet time and time again, the Australia Institute has succeeded in making politically impossible ideas seem inevitable. But we can't do it alone. If you love Follow the Money, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution in our end of financial year appeal. Even better, thanks to 4 generous donors, every dollar donated until June 30 will be matched, dollar for dollar, until we reach our goal. So you'll double your impact if you make a donation at australiainstitute.org.au today. I hope you enjoyed today's show.
You can sense this despair is probably too strong a word, but this kind of resignation to what a disaster the United States is kind of walking into and whether there's even any possibility of avoiding it.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. Let's face it, Australian politics can get pretty fraught at times, but take a look across the Pacific at our great and powerful friend, the United States of America, and you realise things could always get worse.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
The fact is that everything he's saying so far is simply a lie.
These are bad people. These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people.
I'm not here to call out his lies. Everybody knows he's a liar.
And we have a president and a group of fascists that don't want to do anything about it.
Wait a minute. You get the final word, Mr.
Well, it's hard to get any word in with this clown.
The presidential election will be unique for many reasons this year, but it just gained another, with Donald Trump becoming the first American president to be found guilty of a crime.
This jury in New York City, a jury of his peers finding the former president guilty on every single felony count brought against him by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office.
His response was shocking, if not surprising.
It was a rigged trial. We had a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. There's never been a more conflicted judge. This is all done by Biden and his people. Maybe his people more importantly. I don't know if Biden knows too much about it, because I don't know if he knows about anything.
So, with just months until the presidential election, what impact might this have on the campaign? What are shaping up as the key issues? And what might this campaign mean for Australia and our relationship with the United States? Joining us to discuss these questions and more is the Australia Institute's Senior Researcher for our International and Security Affairs program, Dr. Emma Shortis. G'day, Emma. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ebony. Thanks for having me.
So, Emma, you have just got back from a trip to the United States, and it's only 5 months out from the election. Tell me about the atmosphere over there at the moment.
So I had I think quite a particular experience of the United States, because part of the reason that I was there was to be a kind of fly on the wall at the Libertarian National Party convention, where Donald Trump was actually speaking alongside Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy. So again, that's a very particular, I guess, experience of American politics. And it was wild. The Libertarian Convention, of course, is filled with some pretty interesting characters who have some pretty strong opinions on American politics. And Trump was actually invited there to basically to kind of convince them, I suppose, to vote for him. This is a measure of how close the polls are suggesting this is going to be, that Trump's kind of chasing the 3% Libertarian vote. And it was surprisingly hostile, I guess, in that atmosphere, in that the Libertarian party. Libertarians don't love Trump. They have a lot of issues with his failure, I suppose, to deconstruct the administrative state, as they would put it, or to kind of go after the deep state. There's a lot of hangover from his COVID lockdown policies that, again, libertarians hate. And so, you know, this is the event that he actually got booed at.
The Libertarian Party should nominate Trump for President of the United States. Whoa. That's nice. That's nice. Only if you want to win. Only if you want to win. Maybe you don't want to win. Maybe you don't want to win.
You know, he showed up and started doing his lines on the auto cue and was heckled and booed, and then had his own supporters doing kind of counter chants. So it was really wild to be part of. You know, I started right at the front. I got there early and got a great seat where I was like, oh, this is awesome. We're going to be able to see Trump so clearly. And about an hour in, because of course you have to get there so early, I thought, you know what, I'm going to move back. And it was definitely the right decision. I could still see Trump. I could still kind of get a handle on his presence in the room, but I definitely felt a bit safer up the back.
Yeah. And so, Emma, I mean, you talk about that kind of wild campaign atmosphere, but what are some of the key election issues that are on the agenda for this presidential campaign?
It's really hard to get past Donald Trump himself as the election issue because, of course, you know, he's now been found guilty of 34 separate felony charges in New York around this hush money case. And as you said, Eb, he has been laying the groundwork for a long time around undermining the institutions of American democracy and, of course, the rule of law. And so that has become a central election issue, you know, and Joe Biden has framed it this way from the beginning as, you know, this is a battle for the soul of America. It's a battle for the integrity, I suppose, of American democracy. So that's certainly an election issue. In terms of substantive policy issues, the Republicans and Trump have been very successful, not unlike what has happened in Australia, in making immigration an election issue and really forcing, I think, Joe Biden and the Democrats to move further right on immigration from the South, of course, and the issue of the southern border. So there is a kind of manufactured crisis happening there. Whether that continues for the next several months, I think, is another question. And then, of course, there is Gaza and the Biden administration's response to Gaza. We've seen, you know, in the last couple of weeks, the administration make a real effort towards ceasefire negotiations. And cynically, I think partly that's because the Biden administration or Biden campaign doesn't want this to be an election issue because it's not playing well for Biden for quite obvious reasons. And then there are, you know, what we might describe as sleeper issues as well. Reproductive rights is one that absolutely has not gone away and is having a material impact on people in a number of states. And we saw in the 2022 midterms that was a real mobilising factor. And I expect that it will be again, and also that polls will underestimate how much of a mobilising factor that will be. So all of these issues are intersecting and kind of playing into one another to make really what is a huge mess.
Yeah, and they don't have compulsory voting, so you've also got what motivates people to turn out on election day being, you know, another wild card factor here. But going to the most wild of the wild, you know, we're talking about a presidential election campaign where, as you said, one of the candidates for president of the United States has just been found guilty of how many felony charges?
34.
34, and guilty on all counts. I mean, has this historic turn of events impacted the campaign, or is it more or less on brand for Trump?
It seems like it's kind of on brand, Ev. Like it's actually wild how many times we have to ask ourselves that specific question, like how has this historically unprecedented thing affected their campaign? And then the answer is quite often, well, not much. And we can see that, I think, again of course, we have to be so skeptical of polling, particularly around Donald Trump and mobilisation, but we can see that potentially, at least, this guilty verdict has had a small impact on polls. There's some reporting suggesting that it's meant Trump has dropped 1 or 2 points in national aggregate polls, which of course means he and Biden are even closer together. But that's not a huge effect to have on an election campaign. There's some speculation that the criminal conviction will have a kind of longer-term effect on Trump's support, particularly amongst independents. But really, you know, I think the people who voted for Trump before and who were going to vote for him again have kind of already made the decision, and it was always unlikely that even a criminal conviction would affect them. The question, I suppose, you know, that you were getting at, Eb, is how it affects turnout as well, and that again is incredibly hard to measure partly because this has never happened before, and we also don't know what the sentence is, of course. So Trump has had a pre-sentencing interview with the probation board of New York, who will make a report to the judge. You know, his lawyers will also make a recommendation. The prosecution will make a recommendation. So on the 11th of July US time, we will get a sentence. And again, you know, who knows how that's going to play out. There's, of course, lots of opinions about how he can't possibly get a jail term, etc. But I think we just can't predict what's going to happen there. And I suppose the flip side to all of that, you know, to our continued disbelief that this isn't affecting Trump's approval rating, it's not having a huge effect on general polling of his popularity in election polling, is that Biden's approval rating is so low. Like, this, I think, is partly what explains why it's not having a huge effect on Trump, is that Biden is not inspiring a huge amount of mobilization, at least that we can see. His administration's, or what is perceived as his administration's, lack of response, lack of engagement with feeling about Gaza in particular amongst the Democrats is really affecting, I think, his support, and may well affect turnout as well. So again, it's, you know, untangling how all of these things work together is really, really difficult. But the kind of, I guess, the overarching theme is that both candidates are so uninspiring and are turning voters off politics in a way that could have really significant effects, particularly for Biden in terms of his re-election campaign.
The country appears to be as politically divided as ever.
Just 5 months out from the election, Biden's approval rating has dipped to 37%.
Our first election forecast of the campaign season.
It's basically a coin flip.
The likely rematch between President Biden and former President Donald Trump is neck and neck nationally and in the battleground states.
Breaking: Hunter Biden found guilty on all charges.
As luck would have it, Joe Biden was at a gun control event today. It is quite remarkable that this is the same day his son is found guilty on 3 felony gun charges.
And the Trump campaign is railing against what they see as essentially an investigation that did not go far enough.
So how is that going? Because obviously there's a huge amount of focus on Trump because of the court cases and, you know, because he's just a one-man headline generating machine. But how are things looking for a second Biden term?
Well, look, I think the Biden administration would have thought that he'd had a pretty good week this week in particular. You know, he had that trip to France to commemorate the Second World War and D-Day and was really, I think, kind of acting the statesman in contrast to Donald Trump and you know, what was going on with his court cases. But, of course, because of the nature of media coverage as well, that hasn't got a huge amount of attention. What is getting a lot of attention, of course, is Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, being in court. You know, there are reporters swarming all over that. And then, of course, if you zoom out to the bigger picture and Biden's proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza, which got a lot of positive press, I think, and had a lot of momentum, but then has been fairly catastrophically undermined by this, I'm not sure if I should call it a rescue operation. That's certainly how it's being framed by the Israeli government, but a rescue operation that retrieved 4 hostages and in doing so killed over 200 Palestinians, particularly women and children, and injured something like 700. And so the way that has highlighted how this whole war is being prosecuted and the United States and particularly the Biden administration's role in it, I think is, you know, once again bringing home to a lot of people who otherwise would support Biden, particularly young people and voters of colour, just how much, you know, his administration is still not listening to them and what they're asking for in terms of the role that the United States plays in the world.
I want to go back to Trump now, the black hole that just absorbs sucks in all attention. I was just really struck by how in the wake of that court case, his people have obviously always been framing it as like a politically motivated prosecution, kind of blaming it, laying it at the feet of the Biden administration. But the fact was, it was a jury of his peers in New York that convicted him. And you wrote an excellent piece a few months back about Project 2025 for The Conversation, a plan for the next Conservative president put together by a coalition of about 50 right-wing think tanks. And there's a lot of really troubling kind of anti-democratic stuff that appears in that agenda. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, even if it's just in brief?
Yeah, sure. So it is wild, and it's hard to do it in brief because even just one of their manifestos is like 900 plus pages long. So it's a lot to wade through. But, I guess to go back to your question and to link it to Trump and kind of the rule of law, one of the big plans that this project has, and that is run by the Conservative Heritage Foundation and a bunch of other think tanks, is to really completely gut the Department of Justice. So there's no acknowledgement that this conviction came, as you said, Eb, from a jury of 12 independent peers. This is framed as the Justice Department that's been politicised and weaponised against particularly Donald Trump and anybody who supports him. So part of the plan for a second Trump administration in the hypothetical is to go after the Department of Justice and completely gut it. And that will happen alongside what will be a gutting of the independent public service. So using something called Schedule F, which is an old Trump executive order that would allow them to reclassify independent public servants, civil servants, as political appointees, fire them all, and basically replace them with Trump loyalists who've been vetted with this recruitment tool that the Heritage Foundation has got going, which is a kind of conservative LinkedIn that's like finding the most loyal Trump supporters you can and having them ready to serve in the next Trump administration. So through that, you see a kind of catastrophic, potentially at least, catastrophic undermining of independence and checks and balances in American democratic institutions. And that sits alongside a bunch of other completely wild plans for, we talked earlier about reproductive rights. So there's a line in this manifesto early on about the overturning of Roe v. Wade being just the start. And so pretty brazen and clear plans to go after reproductive rights, to go after contraception as well, which a number of Republicans have kind of been trying to reassure people that they're not doing, in this document and these plans. It's pretty clear that
pretty blatant.
Yep, it's absolutely blatant. They're not. There's no pretending going on. Like, this is one of the wild things is that all of this is publicly available, and it's all written down. And so there's those plans. There are some pretty frightening plans and rhetoric around the US's role in the world, and particularly its approach to China, which would become incredibly hawkish. There are outlines of plans in there to increase the US nuclear arsenal by a significant amount.
If I can just ask you about that specifically, because during the first Trump term, he was pretty isolationist, which a lot of people, I guess, kind of found refreshing in a way, but he was definitely, pursuing a trade war with China. He pulled out of a lot of major international agreements. He was extremely critical of NATO and kind of often talked up his personal relationships with dictators. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about not just China, but what could we expect from a second Trump administration in terms of how America engages with the world? And I guess I'm thinking here specifically of Russia's war in Ukraine and Israel's war in Gaza.
Yeah, so I think what's actually happening at the moment, Eb, is there is a bit of a kind of ideological war in Trump land over what kind of role America should play in the world under a hypothetical second Trump administration. And I think you can see that playing out particularly in the fight over who's going to be vice president. Like, they're having a bit of a stoush over those issues. And there are certain camps, like there are still old kind of cold warriors who are anti-Russia or kind of anti the historic Soviet Union who do advocate for support for Ukraine. But it's pretty clear that in that kind of ideological war, actually the far right that has come to dominate the Republican Party has won that fight and have pretty clearly laid the groundwork for a complete withdrawal of support for Ukraine and for Trump to really lean into that relationship he has with Putin.
I would get him into a room, I'd get Zelensky into a room, then I'd bring them together and I'd have a deal worked out. I would get a deal worked out. The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. Dumb. So dumb.
And that's partly about the Trump-specific, admiration, as you said, Eb, for Putin, but it's also a real ideological alignment between Trumpland and Putin's Russia. Like, there's this idea that, Putin has kind of successfully implemented a white ethno-state and successfully repressed minorities, and that's something to be admired and to replicate, really, in the United States. So that, I think, would be, that aspect of a second Trump administration is particularly frightening. And there's also, of course, what Trump would do about Israel. Like, Biden is, suffering politically because of his failure to act, I think, on Israel's completely disproportionate response in Gaza, whereas in Trumpland, I suppose, there's a fairly unapologetic support, totally unapologetic support for Israel. So I saw, for example, J.D. Vance, the senator for Ohio, speak at a foreign policy conference while I was in DC, and he really just straight up said that there is a moral imperative amongst particularly Christian, white, middle-class Americans to support Israel because, and I'm paraphrasing, but his words were, because our Saviour was born and died and resurrected in those lands. And so that kind of evangelical Christian support for Israel under Trump, I think, would thrive and would be absolutely brought to the fore. So it's quite a radically different kind of foreign policy. Trump would still be Trump, of course. He'd be very unpredictable on the international stage. But I also think it's important to treat those kind of self-interested claims of Trump being anti-war or Trump being isolationist with a fair bit of skepticism, because Trump loves violence. In his first administration in particular, he loved talking about dropping bombs on people and having the biggest bombs and having the biggest nuclear button. And what you can see in these projects that are designing plans for the second Trump administration is an effort to really lean into that and provide a kind of structure to that kind of hawkish, really violent approach to American power that didn't necessarily exist in the first administration.
So I think in Australia we tend to look at a potential second Trump term and think about it through the prism of AUKUS, but I'm actually more interested in our overall relationship with the United States and the kind of alliance that we've traditionally had with them. AUKUS is one part of that, and purchasing nuclear-powered submarines from the United States, but it's obviously much bigger than that. I mean, what are some of your thoughts about the implications for Australia and our relationship with the United States if Trump does secure a second term as president?
I think, the fixation certainly is on AUKUS, exactly as you say, in any of that kind of coverage around Trump. But I would frame AUKUS as kind of a symptom rather than a cause. There is this assumption that even if Trump is elected, even if it's worse than last time, Australia has to maintain its tight-knit relationship with the United States because of the kind of broader, what is always almost without fail framed as the worst strategic circumstances since 1945. But I think the implications of a second Trump presidency is that those so-called strategic circumstances get significantly worse, because what you will see is a ratcheting up of those trade wars with China that of course affect Australia, because we have a different economic relationship with China and a different cultural relationship with China than the United States, even though it's often assumed that we don't. And so what you will see is, I guess, a doubling down of something that's already happened, which is where the Pacific in particular is seen as this kind of giant staging ground on which, great powers do their competition, a great big chessboard that we have to kind of participate in. And that's already dangerous. But in light of a quite unpredictable second Trump administration, where you have a transactional president who is extremely hawkish and, more importantly, has organised hawkish ideologues now behind him and unified behind him, dealing with that becomes incredibly difficult, especially if you've tied yourself so closely that you don't have very much room to move. And so I think we should be having some very serious conversations about what room there is in that relationship, and really doing the work, I think, to shore up our democratic relationship. So much of the relationship is run through departments of defense. It's very secretive. It's assumed that that's how we would have to run a relationship with the Trump administration, as opposed to, for example, working directly with Congress and shoring up and deepening and strengthening relationships between Australian parliamentarians and people in Congress who also have an interest in maintaining the strength and the integrity of American democracy, and have an interest in America operating in the world in maybe a different way, and not a hawkish way, in a way that's focused on peace building. So it's those kind of democratic exchanges, I think, that we should really be focused on, partly because the danger of a second Trump administration to Australia is really so acute.
Mm. And I wonder if you can just kind of give your reflections after having returned from the United States about the overall mood when it comes to the presidential election, and what people are kind of feeling, I guess, as opposed to what the polls are kind of saying.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I would hedge a little bit to say I was in DC. So, of course, in Washington, DC, everybody is hugely politically engaged. And so wherever you go, people were talking about Donald Trump. They were talking about the criminal cases. They were talking about Gaza. They were talking about Biden. But even there, you can sense this despair is probably too strong a word, but this kind of resignation to what a disaster the United States is kind of walking into, and whether there's even any possibility of avoiding it, because, or because of what we've spoken about, Eb, in that, there's such apathy towards both candidates. The fact that we're dealing with now a convicted felon, an actively anti-democratic convicted felon, and he's within a couple of points of the incumbent is really dispiriting, I think. And certainly there was a sense of that in Washington, alongside, I have to say, particularly after spending some time on the Hill in congressional offices, a concerning amount of complacency, I think, amongst Democrats as well, a kind of sense that, everything will be fine. There is a kind of confidence in the Biden administration, which I hope is not misplaced. But after having kind of seen Trump in the flesh and heard him kind of run those lines about, it being the end of the world if Biden is elected, I am still convinced that the United States is kind of teetering on the brink. And even the election in November is not necessarily going to kind of solve those problems. It's not like we're going to wake up on the 6th of November and we'll have a clear answer and everything will be okay. And certainly in DC, that sense of waiting is really, was really present.
Emma, you are also launching your own weekly podcast, After America, in the coming weeks. Can you tell our listeners what they can expect?
I am. Thanks, Ev. I'm super excited about this podcast. Our aim really with this is to not just do another, political punditry analysis of the day-to-day in American elections, though there will be some of that. Our aim is really to look at the election from Australia and from the Pacific and understand what the election, what its results are going to mean for us in Australia and for our region, and to really push back, I think, on that idea that American domestic politics and American foreign policy, and particularly Australia's relationship with America, are like two separate things. Often we treat like the day-to-day of Trump and the kind of craziness of American domestic politics as entirely separate from foreign policy. And what we want to explore is just how connected they are and how much they'll affect us in Australia and in our region.
Wonderful. I can't wait to listen.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us on the show today, Emma.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You can find all the Australia Institute's research on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. Our producer is Jennifer Macy, and our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.